You there. Can't be here.
Don't you throw that thing! I saw you throw that, you fucking maniac!
Hitman is one of the few series to bridge the gap between games I loved as a child and games I genuinely enjoy now. Not that that disparity bothers me very much personally. It's natural enough that tastes change, particularly when you play as often as I do. We all usually have some desire for novelty, a drive to try something fresh which influences us to experiment with games outside our comfort zone. By this I don't mean to say that nostalgia isn't a powerful force in gaming, as it has certainly driven more than one of my recent purchases. But I'm pretty sure I didn't rollick my way through Hitman TM and Hitman 2's story campaigns for nostalgia's sake alone. Just for clarity, I'd like to point out that I first played Hitman TM in 2018, therefore sidestepping all that episodic release nonsense. I've been continuously impressed with the consistency of Hitman's vision. Each entry has captured the same essential gameplay experience and tone, that of a murder machine sneaking around a world that's half spy thriller, half black comedy, assuming we forget about Absolution, and I absolutely advise we do. And yet each has offered meaningful iteration as well as ever-improving UI and ease of use. Not the strange variants and stab-in-the-dark style improvements you see in other series that introduce features one game, only to drop them the next. This has allowed the series to stay modern, to the point where even the most recent release only last year feels as fresh and exciting as any other title. I get pretty defensive of the sexy Danish studio when I hear the series described as Eurojank, particularly by American commentators in an era where Bethesda are still allowed to make games. Back in the PS2 days, most of the best titles were what you might call AA, titles made for slightly cheaper and with slightly less polish than AAA, in theory. Personally, I'm sorry that space has shrunk over the last couple of generations, but at least IO have tried their best to keep it alive. It's a space that Hitman nestles into neatly. The gameplay loop is so simple in principle, and yet complex and nuanced in execution. An admirable combination. Indeed, the premise and objectives for any given mission are summarized in the freaking title of the game. You are the Hitman. Find your targets, eliminate them, and escape. It's an elegance of concept not often seen outside of Nintendo or the indie scene. I think the lurid nature of role-playing a contract killer is a big part of why the series is so immediately appealing in a visceral sense. Certainly it was to me at 11 years old. But the idea lends itself to a game structure so cleverly. There's a reason there never has or never will be a successful Hitman movie. And it's because the core concept is so intrinsically game-like. Better off sticking to Leon. The concept and goals are always the same, but how you get there and the options available to you when you do are staggering for a game that isn't technically an immersive sim. It's clear that IO value player expression much more even than their ability to tell you a story. Hitman games have a plot, but the real stories are the real experiences, are what you concoct with 47 along the way. IO give you the tools, set you on the path, and let you find your own way. That faith in their players is gratifying. But they still feel it's important to give you a grade. Feedback on your performance, which can be a little hard to interpret, but top marks are clearly awarded for no extraneous kills, no alarms, preferably no shots fired, a quiet, clean mission. Fortunately, this is easy enough to ignore if that's not your style, but what keeps me glued to this series is the pursuit of the A+, the Silent Assassin ranking. With these quite sensible restrictions in place, each Hitman level becomes a little puzzle box, a clockwork mechanism of NPCs roaming about the place in the same predictable patterns, waiting for you to slip them by, finding the flaw in the patrol, exploiting vulnerability. These Groundhog Day style routines are reminiscent of Majora's Mask in different variations, albeit with admittedly less charm. All the same, seeking these optimum solutions is the main draw of the series for me, and it's a further credit to the design that this process is so fun and intuitive. The crucial factor is that the world is deterministic, thus eliminating frustration brought about by randomness, but large and complex in order to not feel shallow. Previous games had the added puzzle piece of trying to fill out your armory by sneaking guns and unique melee weapons off the levels too, adding a surprisingly relevant collectathon element to proceedings. But this has been dropped in favour of an experience-based unlock system which I am personally not a fan of. So, in pursuit of top marks, and despite the plethora of options available, I play each mission of Hitman TM and Hitman 2 in roughly the same way, setting out my own gameplay pattern, interest loops and challenges. As I describe this to you, I want you to keep in mind that this is just one of the many ways to approach these problems. and this might not even be the most fun. You might hate playing in this way, but I like to stress again that you don't have to, and that expression is a core strength of this series. The first tenet to my approach is to forget all about Iron Manning. Resets and save scumming are just part of the process, and I don't even feel that bad about it. Proceeding with saves definitely on, the frequency depends very much on my patience on any given day. Whether I feel like repeating sections of not terribly technical gameplay over and over while experimenting. Sometimes that's part of the fun, getting the AI to move in the same way repeatedly is part of the routine, a step in the dance. Other times the deterministic nature of the system makes it a chore, so I tend to save and save scum whenever I feel like it. Although each stage in alert state is very playable and sometimes even recoverable, I consider sounding the alarm to be a failure state, and will always reload after a little target practice or some revenge. On higher difficulties, deciding when to use your saves can be a satisfying strategic challenge, but I think that's something best experienced on a second playthrough. By saving and reloading, completing a mission feels much more like a puzzle game, like the continuous fidgeting of a Rubik's Cube, scratching away one mini objective after another. One attempt doesn't work, but maybe if I try this or that, if I could just get him to turn around, if she would just go and stand by the desk, and gotcha! The next tenet is to emulate the earlier titles as much as possible. Simple close, lockpick, silenced pistol we hope not to use, and our trademark fiber wire. My 47 is a silent strangler. The fact that the wire is totally unnecessary actually adds to the feeling of ownership over the playstyle. This is a key restriction. Each kill has got to be within melee range, and most of the real challenge comes from the puzzle of getting your targets alone in a private space. We hope to God next to a wardrobe. While accident kills, formerly introduced in Blood Money, are great, usually hilarious and orchestrated well, they are messy, loud, and usually come with a great deal of fuss. This just doesn't sit well with my version of 47, who would prefer to remain completely undetectable until it's way too late. I also turn off as much mission guidance as possible. If/when I go for completion, I think there'll be a damn near necessity, but not for the first playthrough of a map. I want to highlight how cool it is that Hitman TM and Hitman 2 can be played pretty much like an adventure game if you feel like it. You can follow the mission stories or opportunities, depending on which game you're playing, to interesting and silly disguises, situations and assassinations. I find this eliminates a lot of the challenge and intrigue of exploration though. I consider this to be one extreme of the broad spectrum of playstyles these games account for, with the other end being the mediocre third-person shooter. I imagine most people fall somewhere in between these extremes, depending on if they care about the ranking as much as I do. Anyway, it's time. The mission starts, and after a cutscene to establish the setting, step 1 is to get a disguise, finding isolated guards or particular persons of interest. Suit-only runs are absolutely a thing, but for me they take the fiddly nature already inherent in this approach to an extreme. Then, often taking advantage of the numerous and well-integrated distraction mechanics and occasional scripted sequence, we must subdue them non-lethally and steal their clothes, alongside any other items in their possession. Obviously by the point I am making this video, I know these levels pretty well, but first time through requires some trial and improvement in order to find the perfect mark, although listening to NPC dialogue can help a lot. With the disguise, it's now possible to get stalking. This is at once not as disturbing and yet actually as disturbing as it sounds, as the goal here is to follow the target to learn their route through the level. Almost none of the targets in these games sit still for very long, but their programmed routes are fixed until the player intervenes in some way. The goal now is to find out when they are most vulnerable to strike, or else seek out another aforementioned scripted sequence to isolate them. This often involves utilizing the OP technique of dropping a weapon so the target's bodyguard wanders off to the lost and found for 30 seconds. I'm not going to lie, all verisimilitude has pretty much gone out the window at this point. No one other than the predetermined enforcers will ever suspect you, as long as you don't trigger them by hurting someone or doing something marked with a red warning. But for me this was another instant of prioritizing the game over the realistic simulation, and it's the right choice. At some point it's likely we'll need to take a detour to subtly and delicately sabotage the surveillance system. This never fails to make me smile. Security cameras make a lot of sense in the places 47 has to infiltrate, and though I do sometimes wish for more sophisticated ways of destroying or avoiding creating evidence in the first place, I imagine this will become tedious in the later levels as the density of surveillance increases quite a lot. On that note, both games have a really nice difficulty curve across their main missions, as both isolating and eliminating targets becomes much more difficult on each successive level. This lends strong credence to the idea that the designers fully intended this to be a valid path through their carefully considered maps. Once alone, The kill itself is straightforward and impersonal. Finally, we've got to get the blighters out of sight, which obviously means schlepping them into the nearest freezer, armoire or dumpster. This can actually be the most difficult part, as you are completely exposed while dragging the poor bastard around like you're the world's saddest potato farmer. With that all done, our objectives are dealt with, and no one on the map is any the wiser about the terrible fate that has befallen their bosses, who, I'd like to stress, are universally horrible people in the fiction of Hitman, and mediocre sims outside that fiction. Anyway, it's time to make our escape. This is by far the easiest part of the mission if everything went to plan. And the contrast between here and the last part is the final bend of an expertly crafted tension curve. The final piece of evidence that the designers accounted for this playstyle is the swelling music that starts as you make your way out, triumphant and invisible. I'll take my silent assassin ranking, thank you very much, and I'll see you next mission. These games are damn funny generally, but my favourite running joke has to be 47's nascent idiot savant abilities. A true renaissance man of gaming if ever there was. He's brilliant at every random thing he has to do to blend in on missions, from massage to yoga, from sissying that walk to this drum solo. I guess it's implied he's a good actor by his ability to blend in with the guards, but I'll be damned if it's conveyed in the presentation.
Dahlia, Helmut here. Remind me again, where were you supposed to meet?